Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Intervigilance's conference on Brexit and its impact on the pharma industry. Caught in the throes of a post-Brexit conundrum, the pharmaceutical industry has many unanswered questions surrounding the risks and potential benefits of Brexit. This conference brings together world-class experts to look at the what, when, where, and how of that impact, and to provide some perspective on a possible Plan B in light of the UK becoming ex-EU. You'll hear from Miranda Dolan, Vice President Pharmacovigilance MAPI Group. Miranda will be talking to us about Brexit and the EEA QPPV. What now? You'll also hear from Colin Hayward, Chief Medical Officer Premier Research. Colin will be dealing with the R&D impact and more specifically the impact on clinical trials. Lauren Ewan, Senior Manager Allergan PV Audit Group, will talk to us about PVQA and the impact on GVP audits. Adrian Zara, Senior Director QA Europe Glenmark Pharmaceuticals, will talk to us about QP-GMP and the challenges for GMP, GDP and RPs. Vicky Page-Clark, EU QPPV and CEO, Lighthouse Pharmacovigilance Limited, will be talking to us about the effects on SMEs and subcontracting. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to this session looking at the potential impact of Brexit on the role of the qualified person for pharmacovigilance in Europe. My name is Miranda Dolan. I'm a Vice President of Pharmacovigilance at the MAPI Group. I have more than 20 years experience in pharmacovigilance, but the last 12 I have been a qualified person for pharmacovigilance. So I'd like to start by focusing on what the role of pharmacovigilance is. The World Health Organization defines this as the science activities relating to the detection, assessment, understanding and prevention of adverse effects or any other drug-related problem. In other words, it's to protect the little guys, to make sure that we're not doing any more harm than we are good when providing them with health care. Pharmacovigilance has come a long way since the Victorian days when we were prescribing cocaine for toothache. It took a big leap in the 1960s. In the 1960s, we saw mornidine being introduced. This is thalidomide being prescribed for women whilst they were pregnant to help with their morning sickness. So now she can cook breakfast again. Unfortunately, thalidomide led to a big disaster, resulting in 10,000 cases of infants having malformation of limbs. This really triggered the pharmacovigilance that we see today, where the World Health Organization took an initiative to have a systematic collection of adverse events in a safety database so that we could truly understand the safety profile of our products and take action to prevent this kind of disaster happening again. We saw another leap in the evolution of pharmacovigilance in 1995, when we saw the role of the European Qualified Person for Pharmacovigilance being introduced. At this point, we wanted somebody to take personal accountability for the safety of patients. Pharmacovigilance has evolved so far by this point, and the size of the pharmaceutical industry has evolved so far, that it was difficult to understand where accountability truly lay for the safety of patients. So the agencies wanted to have one person to take personal accountability for the safety of patients and for the systems being used by the pharmaceutical industry to ensure their safety. So what does the European QPPV actually do? This is a role which every marketing authorization holder in Europe needs to have in place. It is a named individual who is on the marketing authorization for every product with personal accountability for the system and for the patients receiving those products. This person is permanently available 24 hours a day. So if an emergency situation arises, they can be contacted on the weekend, in the middle of the night, to make sure that action can be taken as urgently as is needed. They need to be appropriately qualified and experienced. These individuals have worked in the pharmaceutical industry for decades. They have worked in pharmacovigilance. They understand this science inside out and are best positioned to be able to give appropriate advice both to regulatory agencies and to the pharmaceutical industry. Importantly for today's topic, they are legally required to be resident in the European Economic Area. This means that they can be a resident in any member state of the European Union or some of the EFTA states, including Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland. This role comes with a lot of accountability, and there are penalties for this role not being conducted appropriately. These include financial fines, but also criminal prosecution. And this is to this named individual, not just to the pharmaceutical company who employs them. So now we have a little bit of background on pharmacovigilance in general. I wanted to focus on the UK as we start to think about the implications of the Brexit. So the UK has the UK Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, governing pharmaceutical regulation. And the MHRA is a world leader in pharmacovigilance. They are present at all of the forums discussing the development of regulation. They are present at all of the forums who are making decisions about what to do with the safety of products. Importantly, for Europe, they have played a critical role in the development of the European pharmacovigilance legislation, which we are now required to comply with. Think a little bit more broadly. On a European level, legislation is governed by the European Medicines Agency. This is currently located in London. The European Medicines Agency has a committee which makes decisions at a centralised level across Europe, impacting every patient in Europe. This is known as the Pharmaceutical Risk Assessment Committee, and the chair of this committee is currently a UK chair. So we can see that the UK is not only a world leader, but European pharmacovigilance is tightly integrated with the UK. So now looking at the European Qualified Person for Pharmacovigilance, we actually see that a majority of people holding this role are located in the UK. This reflects the predominance of the UK in the pharmaceutical legislation, the presence of the EMA in the UK, and the fact that many pharmaceutical companies have global or regional headquarters based here in the UK. So what about Brexit? What is the potential impact? And of course today there are many unknowns, but we can look at some possible scenarios which might happen as we move through the Brexit process. So one option, we might choose to leave the European Union, but perhaps stay in the single market, becoming a member of the European Free Trade Association in a manner similar to that of Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland. This would allow the QPPV role to remain in the UK. However, we might see the impact of the MHRA decreasing in this scenario, and this might undermine the role of the QPPV. What if the UK leaves both the UK and the single market? A scenario which is looking increasingly likely at the moment. In this situation, the QPPV would definitely have to leave the UK, and it's probable that the European Medicines Agency will also leave the UK. So what is the impact if that happens? So a potential concern is the loss of UK pharmacovigilance experts. The QPPV is a critical role in the pharmaceutical system. We see them ensuring that the global pharmacovigilance system is in place and is compliant, and that appropriate decision-making is being taken place for patients. In addition, with the number of global and regional headquarters that we see in the UK, we might well see a loss of leadership from there as companies consider whether or not to keep those entities here in the UK. We might have a loss of ability to influence global pharmacovigilance systems. The QPPV does not just look after the European pharmacovigilance system. They need to ensure that worldwide pharmacovigilance activities are taking place, that the adverse events and safety issues occurring outside of the UK are appropriately communicated here, and that the appropriate decision-making can take place. With the possible move of the EMA outside of the UK, the MHRA influence might decrease. We might have less ability to impact that European level of legislation, which makes the European Union a very safe place for pharmacovigilance activities. We might see a loss of business for UK service providers. The role of the QPPV is such a niche product that we often see it outsourced to service providers. With that comes other activities. It's often that not only is the QPPV outsourced, but pharmacovigilance activities linked to the pharmaceutical systems are also outsourced. So we might see those activities moving outside of the UK as well. And all of this means the potential for a loss of jobs. There might be movement of the QPPV, but there might also be movement of global and regional departments outside of the UK. And the transition of the EMA outside of the UK has also potential for us to see loss of jobs. But ultimately, all of this concern is about the potential impact on the patients. They are the reason that we are all here performing this job, the reason why this legislation has been put in place. Patient safety in the UK is actually based on what is happening across Europe. We have a system in place which allows early signals to be detected from patient activity in Europe and also outside of Europe. We have a system which allows for early decision making and then harmonised action across the European Union. If the UK is not part of that, what is the impact on the UK patient going to be? We have a very robust process in place where we can detect a safety issue worldwide. We can validate that it truly is a signal and not background noise. We can prioritise how quickly it needs to be actioned. And then we can assess what needs to be done. Does action need to be taken in just one country? Does it need to be taken across Europe? Do we need to start interacting with other agencies outside of Europe? And then we have to make recommendation for action and exchange information with all of our stakeholders, not just the regulatory agencies, but also healthcare professionals, patients, anybody who is involved in the healthcare system. So we might lose our ability to be involved in this process early and to be part of this harmonised decision-making process which protects the health of all of the patients in the UK. This is our primary concern about the impact of Brexit. There's also a significant resource implication. The UK legislation is predominantly based on the European legislation. It essentially says, follow the European requirements with very little adaptation for the UK. If we lose access to that legislation, we'll need to completely redesign a new set of legislation for the UK. And do we have the resources available to do that? And is a 2-year Brexit plan sufficient time to do that? This is a significant concern as new legislation normally takes a lot longer than 2 years to implement. However, this is also an opportunity for us. I don't want to leave with just the bad news story. So what could we do? The UK leadership in pharmacovigilance is not something that we want to lose. This could potentially be an opportunity to build it further and to take our interest not just in what's happening in Europe, but to take it outside of Europe. So we could strengthen our relationships, for example, with the FDA or Japan or other key regions. And we might have less constraint than we have at the moment, having to work within the European structure. So there's a potential opportunity for us to look outside of Europe and to further our leadership within pharmacovigilance. We do want to continue personal accountability for safety. The role of the qualified person is in European legislation, so that European level role will disappear if the UK leaves the European Union. So we would strongly recommend that we actually establish a new local role at the national level for the UK. And therefore we can continue to have personal accountability for the safety of patients and not have accountability being diluted across a global organisation and the complications that come with that. This would also allow for a forum where we could collaborate in the development of any new legislation and for the maintenance of that legislation in the long term. And we would very much like to see the UK-based QPPVs involved in the development of any new legislation. This would also allow a forum for expertise which could be used for the evolution of relationships outside of the UK and outside of Europe. This would be a readily available pool of talent and expertise which could partner with the UK legislators as we look to develop these new relationships moving forward. We would also like to see a national pharmacovigilance association dedicated to the UK. There are a number of associations at the moment which look at the European level or the international level. However, we would like to see the UK-based QPPVs having the ability to come together to pool their talent and their expertise. And this again would allow a structured mechanism for consultation during the development of legislation, for access to expertise by the industry and by the regulators, and the development of common approaches. Between us, we see many different ways of approaching the same problem, and if we can collaborate, we can maybe find a smooth transition into the future. And this allows the opportunity to build on this UK presence of pharmacovigilance that we already have. What is happening at the moment? We're at very early stages of Brexit, so I'm sure this story is going to continue to evolve over the next few months and years. However, the UK parliamentary select committees have a group dedicated to science technology, and they have an open inquiry at the moment about leaving the European Union, and they have asked for feedback on the implications and the opportunities for science and research. A group of QPPVs have submitted some written evidence which you can find on their website at the link shown on the slide. This is just one step in this story, so what can you do to help? You can submit additional statements to the Select Committee so that we see multiple layers of understanding and opinions about the impact of Brexit. You can make an appointment to see your MP to discuss this in further detail. You can contact any associations that you are a member of, the Drug Information Association, for example, and volunteer your services for Brexit. But importantly, we need to be heard. We know that the parliamentary system may not be that familiar with pharmacovigilance, yet alone the role of the qualified person. And we really want to see the qualified person taking a pivotal role as we move pharmacovigilance forward into this new era. This is a unique pool of people who have the expertise and the talent and the knowledge to help drive this forward. And we need to be heard that this expertise is available for consultation as we move into the future. So thank you very much, and thank you to a number of QPPVs who have helped put together this information and participated in the development of the statement which has been submitted to the Select Committee. Thank you for your attention today, and don't hesitate to contact me or anybody else on that list if you have any questions.
Thank you very much to Nimisha and the Intuvigilance team for inviting me to this Brexit conference and to discuss the impact or potential impact of Brexit on clinical trials. My name's Colin Hayward, I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Premier Research. Brexit and clinical trials could affect a number of touch points throughout the whole clinical trial process, from patients, our own individual careers, academic funding, where the EMA is to be located in time, all the way to market access of new drugs and market authorization. Where I'm going to focus today, though, is just on a few key points that I'm particularly interested in, particularly clinical trial regulations. How are they going to be affected going forwards? Funding, particularly for academic research and for SMEs. Scientific talent. How are we going to recruit the best people in the UK going forward? The cost of studies. How much are studies going to cost to be placed in the UK? And just going to give an idea of some potential next steps of where we as UK R&D leaders need to start pushing and promoting the government. So just to give some background, roughly 73,000 people in 2013 were employed in the whole pharmaceutical industry, and I think the pharmaceutical industry has a continual line between people who are recruited in R&D to pure outright marketing, and I think even those people in marketing are touched by R&D. But the ABPI figures here, roughly 25,000 people employed in the R&D industry in pharma. And the value added of the industry, we can see that the pharmaceutical industry, as measured by GVA, adds one of the most values of any industry in the UK. And if we look at R&D spend, and clearly this isn't just clinical trials, but obviously clinical trials are a key component of this, pharma is right up there at number one of all the industries. So touching on my first point, clinical trial regulations, how might the UK be affected? Well, the EU Clinical Trial Directive, I'm sure is familiar to many of you, really enforced from about 2004, has supposedly led to a decrease in clinical trials in Europe. Now, whether that decrease was down to the regulations per se or the ability of centres to uptake those regulations is debatable. But in some research from the European Commission, they found that overall applications fell by 25% for clinical trials, and at the same time cost, presumably linked to an increase in bureaucracy, rose significantly. And this also led to delays in starting those clinical trials. The UK, in one particular study from 2001 to 2009, saw a decrease of 5.3% of clinical trials. And similarly in Germany and France, there were decreases. And this was mainly driven by reduced academic research. However, it wasn't all bad news, and we can see, whilst there were decreases in studies in the UK, Germany and France, there was actually slight increases in Italy and Spain. So what next? Well, clearly there's a new EU clinical trial regulation coming into force, probably by latest October 2018. And so the UK Brexit plans and the timing of the implementation of that new clinical trial regulation will be important to see. The objective of this new regulation, 536/2014, is to overcome some of the issues faced by the original clinical trial directive, particularly in reducing administration, improving efficiency of those studies. So some of these key points, and I'm just going to take my time to go through some of the key points in the new proposed regulation. And that's about having a streamlined application procedure, a single point of entry to an EU portal, a single set of documents to be prepared and submitted for the application. So no submitting piles of different documents in different languages to every single country. And this is then a harmonised procedure of applications. One important thing in terms of speeding up is strictly defined deadlines for the assessment of the CTA. Simplified reporting procedures, so we're not reporting to different people in different countries at different timelines and different things. And therefore, the onus on the sponsors as well to have an increased transparency in clinical trials. And the Union controlling member states and third countries to ensure that clinical trial rules are being properly supervised and enforced throughout. So there's a standardised level of compliance and quality within those trials. I think this last bullet on the slide is important and may be applicable to the UK, is that clinical trials conducted outside the EU, but referred to in a clinical trial application within the EU, will have to comply with regulatory requirements that are at least equivalent to those applicable in the EU. So that's saying that any studies that involve the EU will have to have, as a minimum, the same standards as EU studies. I'm going to move on to funding of research. If we look at the UK, roughly 32% of R&D is financed by the UK government, and business enterprise financing about 45%. There's a high overseas investment in UK R&D, 17%, in the UK versus roughly an average of 8% across the EU and 5% in the non-profit sector. So there's a big question mark for me about whether that overseas investment will continue. Will the confidence from overseas investors in the UK research industry continue post-Brexit? And perhaps when I was doing my research for this talk, the things that made me the most nervous were the funding from Central Europe. So the EU itself is a major source of R&D finances with programs such as FP7 and then going forwards Horizon 2020. Over 11% of funding of higher education centres, universities for example, in the UK is from EU, and some centres this is up to 20%. The UK as well receives nearly 5 billion euro, equivalent to 15% of the total FP7 funding. So only Germany receives more than the UK from the EU. France, for example, receives less than 4 billion euro, so around 11.5% of all the FP7 funding. Collaboration as well is important, not only the funds themselves, but the collaboration that this creates. For example, a lot of the rare disease type centres that we work with, the UK is involved in more successful projects than any other country. 41% of all grant agreements in the FP7 included at least one UK participant, and there's potential that those are in jeopardy going forward. UK academia represents over 60% of all UK participations. But it's not just academia. Many of these applications are from private commercial enterprises and UK SMEs. And we can see from reports in the newspapers recently that potentially ongoing grant applications to Horizon 2020 are starting to bias not having UK participants for fear of that jeopardising the proposal. What about scientific talent in the UK? Clearly, not all of our scientific talent comes from just EU centres, but comes globally, and I think the UK has always been a global base for scientific research and working. If you look at my CV, certainly I've enjoyed being able to work in different countries. I was born in England, but I had Irish ancestry. My son was born in Switzerland while I was lucky enough to work in Switzerland, and now currently working in the UK owned company in the European head office based in the UK. So there are a number of touch points to my own life that might have been affected by a UK Brexit. If we look at the UK scientific workforce, this is looking at just doctors and nurses who will be delivering a lot of our research and our clinical trials in the UK. So from the EU alone, 10% of all doctors and 4% of nurses. And if we look at all of industry, where the top sectors are for foreign-born workers, we can see at number 5, scientific R&D, with nearly a quarter of all employees foreign-born. Now, looking at this, I started looking at my own UK-based team, and it was surprising that over 50% of them are actually foreign-born, not just from EU countries with a terrific heritage of R&D like Italy, but also from Turkey, South Africa, a number of countries. So one potential effect of Brexit is the cost of studies and the cost of doing studies in the UK. And if we look at the dollar versus the pound over the last 12 months, we can see that there's been a strengthening of the dollar against the pound, so that so that companies based in the US doing research in the UK will actually find that cheaper and get better value for money. So that has the potential to make the UK more attractive for the service industry, for centralised services like CROs like ourselves, single service providers, for example, for placement of studies, investigator fees reducing, for example, and centralised services, as I mentioned before. So there's a lot of thoughts there about how Brexit could affect R&D and particularly clinical trials going forwards. Certainly this was a number of people's thoughts the day after the referendum was announced, and this is the stages of grief, but it has happened, so we need to get on with it and move forwards. Ultimately, we don't know. I haven't got a crystal ball here today to tell me whether things are going to be better, worse, or just the same as they always were. However, looking at what our sponsors do, and our sponsors tend to be the innovative biotechs with focuses on rare diseases, analgesia, oncology and neuropsych indications, what do they want in clinical trials? They want a conclusive study as soon as possible. That involves a rapid study startup, as quick as possible recruitment, quality data, and they want cost-effective clinical trial implementation. So here are the 5 key areas I think from a clinical trial industry we should be focusing on. The first thing, of course, is make decisions as soon as possible, and I think the UK government needs to make it clear what their plans are as soon as possible regarding Brexit. I think uncertainty is destabilising, as we can see from potential withdrawal of UK applications in Horizon 2020. And so we need to confirm those Brexit plans as soon as possible. Secondly, EU regulations and the UK clinical trial regulations must be at worst mirrored. Ideally, there would be a mutual recognition of UK clinical trial regulations to the EU, new regulations coming at latest in October 2018. Certainly what we do not want is any additional bureaucracy, any additional documentation submissions, different guidelines for the UK clinical trials over the EU. Thirdly, we want to make sure that the country, the UK as a whole, is an attractive place for scientists to come and work. Looking around in my organisation, my team, my colleagues, my friends in other companies, there is a high diversity, recognising that we can bring in the top R&D talent into our companies. Fourthly, we need to make sure that this potential funding gap, for example, the €5 billion from FP7 that went to UK, is plugged. With this funding, there is also a potential collaboration gap as well, and the opportunity of EU funding meant that there was huge opportunities to work with a number of EU centres, and again, for some particular therapy areas, this is really important. Lastly, what we need to do is ensure that the economic policy of the UK as a whole makes clinical trials in the UK as cost effective as possible. So going forwards, it's clear that there is a number of uncertainties, so we need to pave the way and be as positive as possible to make the UK an attractive place to continue to do clinical trials. Thank you for listening.
So my name is Lauren Ewan. I'm a pharmacovigilance auditor for Allergan. I've been in the industry for 12 years, 5 of which have been in auditing, and I'm here today to talk about pharmacovigilance audit and the impact that Brexit has had upon it. So currently we're auditing against the new pharmacovigilance legislation which came into force in 2012. This legislation makes pharmacovigilance audit activities a legal requirement. The requirement sits within EU law, but it does apply to global PV systems if they manage safety for products that are authorised within the EEA. GVP Module 4 defines the requirements for pharmacovigilance audit and how they should be met and conducted. GVP Module 4 talks about risk-based audit planning. So this is looking at the strategical level planning, tactical level planning and operational level planning. So from a strategical level plan, we're looking at the audit universe, all of the elements which should be included for auditing. This will be for marketing partner audits, for vendor audits, pharmacovigilance system audits and for subsidiary audits. From the tactical point of view, this is the annual audit plan. So this is defining which audits will be conducted over a defined time period. And this will be based upon what has come out of your strategic level planning. We then have the operational plan, and this will be the audit plan for that individual audit, defining what will be looked at during the audit, any samples that will be taken, and what will be included as part of the scope of the audit. It talks about governance. So this is the management support of the audit programme, ensuring that the audits are conducted according to the risk-based audit plans. And the QPPV involvement, so the option that they can request audits if they identify certain risks. GVP Module 4 also talks about the audit reporting and follow-up, so ensuring that an audit report is issued, that observations are defined according to different classifications, critical, major and minor. It says that we need to have timelines by which we issue the audit reports and that they should be distributed to management within the marketing authorisation holder. It talks about follow-up of the audit reports, ensuring that we have corrective and preventative actions to address those audit findings, and ensuring that we follow up to make sure that those actions are completed and that we verify and review documentation. In terms of the auditors themselves, it says that they have to be trained and experienced to do pharmacovigilance audits. It talks about their training on the GVP modules themselves. It talks about the standards for outsourcing of audits. So having a requirement to do pharmacovigilance audits is often difficult for smaller companies, and outsourcing of audits is becoming very common. If this approach is taken, it sets out the requirements for outsourcing of those audits. So within the UK, currently the UK has adopted the EU legislation. The MHRA were an influential authority in the development of this legislation, and they inspect pharma companies to these standards. During inspections, the MHRA focus heavily on the audit programme. Some common findings that we've seen during their inspections are around an insufficient audit programme, so not covering all the applicable elements of a PV system, not including vendor audits, not looking at all the elements of a system or marketing partners, for instance. Another finding we often see is around poorly trained or unqualified auditors. So not being trained in pharmacovigilance, not having the relevant experience, having GMP or GCP auditors doing pharmacovigilance audit without the relevant training and expertise. There's also been findings around risk planning being insufficient. So not having a risk tool or looking at the audits to identify those with the higher risks. They also like to see documentation of this, so being able to demonstrate why certain audits have been selected. Some of the most experienced PV auditors do sit within the UK as a result of the high standards of the agency. So what happens post-Brexit? So at the moment, honestly, no one knows. We conducted a small survey to understand the concerns and opinions of some of our colleagues. So the questions that we asked were, firstly, which country are you based? Secondly, are you employed by a pharma company, CRO or an independent consultant? Is your role within PV audit or another area of PV? Do you think Brexit will have an impact on PV audit according to your perspective in your current role? If yes, we've asked them what impact they think it will have, and then any other comments. So now we'll just go through some of the answers of the survey. So we had 11 responses, 4 were from the US, 7 from the UK. They were from pharma companies, CROs and some independent consultants. And their roles varied between that of PV auditors, EU QPPVs and PV operations, including quality and compliance roles. So the opinion was essentially split. So our responses indicated half thought there would be an impact, half thought there wouldn't, and then we had a couple of respondents who honestly didn't know. So for those who thought there would be an impact on Brexit, these were some of the comments that we received. One of the opinions said that they thought there could be an impact, as some companies may choose to move out of the UK. And this would then mean that global processes may not be based in the UK, and that would mean the location of audits would move from the UK to potentially other countries or where other functions may be based. Another opinion was that more audit requirements may come into play. So currently we're auditing to EU requirements. If the UK were to have their own set of requirements, this would be another set of legislation auditors would have to learn and audit to. It could mean more travel. So with the role of the EU QPPV potentially being moved from the UK to another European country, it may mean that audits then need to be based out of those countries. Someone said that they only see an impact if we don't adopt the EU legislations into our statutes. So again, if we create our own set of legislation and don't fall in line with the EU requirements. Someone has said there are so many unknowns. It could take over 20 years to see the impact. There has been a concern that compliance will slip. So the MHRA has a very high standard of inspections and the detail that they go into. There's a concern that without this set of requirements for the MHRA to inspect against, that companies won't then have to implement corrective and preventative actions as a result of their inspections. The last comment we had was that once the UK figures are out, if it will still follow the EU legislation or their own requirements again. So another concern around whether the UK will have their own set of requirements that will be different to the EU requirements. So for the comments that we had around there being no impact, I think we've seen that in the short term, they feel there'll be no impact. Audits need to continue, the legislation is still in place, and we still have the same requirements we need to follow. But perhaps in the longer term, we may see this change. Another comment was that it's likely that the UK will adopt the EU legislation, and so that for PV auditors, nothing really will change. Other comments we've seen are potential changes to the EU legislation if the MHRA aren't involved. So as the MHRA are very key in providing input to the legislation, we may see changes there. Again, the potential move of the EU QPV in their location. And the last comment we had was it depends on the nature of Brexit. So if we join the EEA, then we won't see as many changes within our requirements for audit. So final thoughts that we have. So as with everything Brexit, no one is quite sure of the impact yet. Within the EU, PV audit will continue according to the legal requirements. Since the MHRA was so instrumental in developing the legislation, it seems likely that national requirements will essentially mirror those in Europe, and perhaps with some national nuances. So we do quite often hear that the MHRA have requirements they've been trying to push to get into the GVPs, so this may be a chance where they can define some of those expectations more clearly. There is already a question as to what will happen to EU-based QPPVs. Will this then translate to UK-based auditors? So will they also need to relocate to the EU countries? Will the EU consider them qualified to audit against the EU requirements in the future? So there are a few final outstanding questions there. Ultimately, though, we will just have to wait and see.
Hi, my name is Adrian Zara. I'm a QP and a Senior Quality Director for Glenmark Pharmaceuticals in Europe. And today I've chosen the topic QP and GMDP. challenges for MA holders, importers and release sites after Brexit. So in terms of my presentation today, I'd like to make it clear that I am not representing Glenmark's views. These are purely my personal views as a QP. I've had about 22 years of experience working in various fields across several European countries, including the UK, in batch release and also in quality control. So it's been a very, very interesting, fascinating 3 months or so. A lot of news coming hard and fast. We now have a smaller number of scenarios that are a distinct possibility, although nothing is still very clear. But many of the participants in the political and technical discussions seem to agree that this will definitely be a Brexit. So the UK will no longer be a member of the European Union, although not many people are in agreement as to what Brexit will look like. Ultimately, we do have 3 possible models, and in order to keep the talk to the point, I focused on the most likely scenario. So I consider the possibility of an EEA single market model, such as is shared with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. But that seems increasingly unlikely because of the British insistence on the limitation of movement across the single market. So it seems like at best it will be something similar to a mutual recognition agreement access to the single market, which is desired by most business owners. So similarly as is shared by Switzerland, Japan, Canada, Australia and New Zealand and Israel. There is a concern that there may not be enough time to negotiate this. However, I believe that this is probably the most likely scenario because Britain is negotiating from a position of strength because it is already within the European Union. So all it needs to negotiate, strictly speaking, would be the opt-outs. The other alternative is not very suitable for most of the pharmaceutical industry because it is essentially a customs union. So some goods, probably including pharmaceuticals, but no services. This is the type of agreement which countries like Turkey, Andorra, Monaco, Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, and the British bases in Cyprus have. This is relatively simple and quick, so it could be a solution of last resort. In terms of timing, provided that the most quoted scenario of the announcement being around end quarter one or end of 2017, that means Brexit would happen somewhere around the end of 2019. In terms of QPs, our role would definitely have to be redimensioned since there would be no more releases occurring from the UK into Europe or the EEA without them having to be redone in Europe. So that obviously reduces the attraction for companies to take that model. Similarly to the Swiss model, what we can probably foresee, there will be a requirement for at least administrative release of all batches imported into Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I don't believe that the UK would want to set up a separate system of release because the QP model has been proven in many, many cases as being the right model for pharmaceuticals, at least in our scenario. There might be less opportunities for work in multinational supply chains and possibly more opportunities to work for local and national releases. This is starting to become more likely as American and Japanese multinationals consider whether to move their headquarters to Europe as they have threatened. Obviously, we're not sure of any of this, so a lot of the information has been collected from a review of the technical literature. A lot depends on the success or failure of the national efforts to bring back manufacture into the UK. So it is obviously not necessary to be in Europe in order to create a very productive, very efficient manufacturing infrastructure. Plenty of countries have that outside the European context. So long as the UK counterbalances its lack of connectivity to the single market with an increase in productivity and efficiency related to manufacture, that would probably help QPs keep their very significant role as the controllers of the supply chain. So there may be a global shake-up, a global rebalancing of the industry, with some industries moving onshore onto continental Europe and some industries coming offshore into the UK. Whatever it is, what we can say is that the QPs will still be highly valued. They're the most experienced, most qualified pharmaceutical experts, both from MHRA side and also as employers. It is possible to countenance that QPs will be perhaps more valued now in terms of their influence and suggestions and consultancy in terms of design of quality systems, whereas because of the heavy load of releasing into Europe before, most of the experienced QPs were tied up with supply chain audits, especially in recent years. What is of concern to me, as I guess many other QPs, is the fact that in this current discussion we are probably the only stakeholder group with no official representation. Our role changes from context to context depending on which industry we work for. So let's start with considering the MA holders, importers, and wholesalers. The number of new MAs may drop dramatically after Brexit has taken effect, since UK may no longer be sought after as a reference member state. It is again difficult to understand which model MHRA will adopt, as they are keeping very reticent aspect in terms of how they foresee their role as part of a greater European network. This clearly depends on the negotiations. However, what we can see is that many companies at the moment are taking a business as usual approach. So the number of MAs will still continue right up until it is clear what will be the scenario. In an EEA type scenario, obviously the UK would be still part of the medicines approval network as a concerned member state. Currently, around 25% of pharmaceutical production from the UK goes to the EU, and nothing much is expected to happen to that. It would cost too much, and it would be unnecessary to make significant changes to those pharmaceuticals. Obviously, if no new pharmaceutical registrations come in, that figure would gradually drop over time. The European Medicines Agency and potentially multinational headquarters, which have come to be based around the southeast and London area in order to be close to the European Medicines Agency and its direction, these may move to new European locations. These co-locations, as I call them, bring clustering activity, highly technical regulatory affairs, R&D expertise, and I think QPs would, unless they do form part of this cluster and devise new ways of connectivity, of working with these people in different territories, I think there may be a loss of this expertise which QPs rely on. Technical agreements and service supply contracts will clearly have to be rewritten due to post-Brexit changes, whichever way that goes. And this will also be part of the game plan of many companies as they consider what to do in the light of the various scenarios as they play out. The parallel importation industry, in a clear hard Brexit scenario, will probably die a slow natural death as the connection between the medicines control environment in the EU and outside the EU will change. Again, provided that an EEA type of agreement is kept, this may not be the case. It is possible to also envisage that there will be fewer takeovers and mergers as a result of Brexit. Clearly the UK, though a large and significant market, would not hold any major attractions for large companies trying to increase their size, because the size would still be located in a single market. There may be local interest in increasing the magnitude of the companies. However, the attraction will not be there because of the restrictions posed by the competitions authority. Because a larger percentage of a smaller market is much easier to reach, and many companies are already at that size in the UK market. So the demand for more QPs, could this possibly drop slowly over time? Would this lead to the skilling as it becomes a less attractive option? These are all things which need to be analyzed. In terms of service providers to the supply chain, this is where a lot of contract QPs are employed in release sites, performing audits or providing consultancy to small and medium-sized companies. The activity here is not expected to decrease. If anything, it may need to increase because of the changes to the supply chain. So losses would probably be made up from formerly EU-located services being transferred in-house. Again, here we're envisaging possibly different approaches to laboratory testing and quality control. The UK has a very strong laboratory sector, and these are all things which need to be considered. US and Japanese companies may still shift services to facilities in Europe. This cannot be prevented because most of these companies are multinational, and their bases in the UK are mainly logistical or R&D bases, and they are business clusters located here primarily due to the interest shown in the MHRA's close relationship with the FDA and the EMA. The EMA will definitely move, and the MHRA, which has loaned a lot of its expertise to the EMA, stands to lose that expertise or else face a financial challenge to try and build up that expertise once more. It is, however, expected that the R&D biotech clusters around the major universities in the UK will be retained, and QPs will continue to benefit from the opportunities these spin-off companies offer in terms of innovation and startup activity. Contractors operating for European companies, so these are people who are based in the UK and perform services for companies in Europe. There are some companies which apply strict work permit restrictions for non-EU members, and this would obviously impact heavily on QPs. However, this sector is still expected to grow because the QP as such, in terms of qualifications and experience, it's difficult to envisage a work permit system which could successfully keep out a QP. QP API GMP certification and audits may suffer unless as part of transnational partnerships and cooperation. If the MHRA is operating a similar system to the EU system on its own, the burden on QPs may grow if the EU does not recognize other QPs work from outside the UK and vice versa. So this is a very beneficial area of the QP's work, and any impact on this would be worrying. In terms of interaction with the regulator, again, the QPs are not usually involved directly, but they may be involved at higher levels of organizations, and they also contribute to the technical input to that interaction. So the European Medicines Authority will definitely move away from London, and the lobbying for this has already started by several countries. Will the working language of the Medicines Authority change? I don't think so, because English is the language of the pharmaceutical industry, has always been. However, that is potentially a concern. The MHRA faces an existential crisis as it withdraws from pivotal roles, chairing key committees and influencing European pharma policy. It has always taken a very leading role within Europe, and many ex-QPs have found senior roles within MHRA. Its latest position, as listed on the website, is that it will try to provide the full range of services to both the industry and the public, with less resources and the potential for burden sharing. In one of its statements, it compared one of the potential models as being an FDA model. However, there is a big difference between the UK market and the US domestic market, and I'm not really that sure that with funding restrictions the MHRA would be able to deliver all these services. The QP faces potentially complex interactions with the agency initially, as government policy tries to balance out the EU trade against US, Commonwealth and China. So we're looking at potentially country-specific trade negotiations, which will lead to very specific requirements for individual countries. So the QP's job in terms of releases for domestic use when dealing with imports directly from these countries becomes much more complex, and it is, I think, reasonable to assume that each country would try to negotiate as much of a good deal as possible for its domestic pharmaceutical industry as well. The UK, I think it's safe to assume, will still be part of the PICS, so we don't think that there will be any major GMP changes to be expected. However, will the UK still have a seat at the International Conference on Harmonization, ICH? That is still to be seen. Of course, there's nothing to stop the UK and the MHRA specifically to look for partnerships with EU agencies, and this could also help to reduce the risk of complex interactions when it comes to individual EU countries. In terms of recruitment and professional development of the sector, which I will now turn to, the UK has obviously become less attractive to EU QPs in the interim as a result, because many people now thinking of coming to the UK for a future career would be looking at things like pension systems or transferability of their work experience and qualifications. So again, unless these things become very clear very soon, the EU QP population, as I put it, would think again as to whether the UK is an attractive option, and this can exacerbate the difficulty in finding QPs in the short term. The UK pharma industry will probably reorient towards global export of pharma products, so this creates a more complex environment with multiple sets of regulations. Again, this makes it more daunting for new QPs coming into the field, because it will probably take them longer before they feel comfortable in starting up on their own or sitting for the QP exam. The QP role changes focus away from market release. If it does so, it will require roughly the same number of QPs at present. We don't think that any of the changes, although complex, will affect the number of QPs or force any QPs to withdraw from the field. So whilst it makes it more difficult for EU QPs to come in and fill gaps, it should not discourage any younger pharmacists or biologists or chemists who would like this to enter this career. Contract jobs may, however, become less lucrative if European releases cannot be done, because the quantity and the quality of the contracts available may suffer. So again, this could create a downside, a negative to people considering becoming QPs. There may be difficulty in sourcing lower salaried, lower ranking support staff because there's a lot of these people who are coming from European, particularly Eastern European companies at the moment. However, again, so long as the UK balances this out by an influx of non-EU personnel, there shouldn't be any significant impact on this sector. So, recapitulating, what does the future hold? There's definitely going to be a lot of uncertainty, fluidity, and transitional arrangements in place until Article 50 has been triggered. We are seeing some movement in that direction already, with many EU meetings already not being attended by the UK at a high level. So there is an element of risk for the UK market there. There will be slightly less uncertainty, a lot more work to do, and changes to the QMS which need to be made once Article 50 is triggered, because then the clock starts ticking and we have 2 years to finish the job. Many technical agreements will take a long time. Supply chains may need to be refined, transportation routes reevaluated, qualified. There will be business continuity initiatives in respect of infrastructure which needs to be moved from the UK to the EU and vice versa. So there will be definitely a lot of work for QPs there. The world as the UK QP knows it will definitely change, but every cloud has a silver lining, as we say, and there will be some threats, but there will also be new opportunities. As a sector, the QP is well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities offered by change. Threats create problems for companies, but they also create opportunities for others, especially companies which act as disruptors and do not rely on their past success to justify their future existence. Important thing is to plan for the unexpected, keep options open for as long as possible. In terms of conclusions and recommendations I would make, I would say to the politicians, we should ensure that the QPs are represented strongly on technical discussions with industry, not necessarily as part of the industry negotiating teams, but also as professionals, because they have a lot to contribute. Industry surveys are required by government and the MHRA to establish company by company, sector by sector, if necessary, what impact Brexit will have once it is defined, once the UK negotiating position is defined, and to identify ways of compensating for this. A manpower resource planning study should be carried out by the pharma industry to ensure that it will have enough QPs, that they are well positioned within organograms, and that they are ready for the future. QPs will need to take on a more authoritative stance within companies, utilize their expertise as internal consultants, especially in this time of uncertainty, and escalate their concerns to top management to ensure that the industry is well prepared for post-Brexit turbulence. And finally, MHRA should consider innovative ways such as partnerships, automatic recognition for products and services licensed in the EU, burden sharing arrangements to keep alive contacts and influence within the European Medicines Authority and the EU Directorate General for Consumer and Health Affairs. I've also provided a set of references with this presentation, which will indicate to the viewer where essentially I have based my opinions on. Thank you for your attention, and good luck with Brexit.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Vicky Page-Clark and I'm the founder and director of Lighthouse Pharmacovigilance Limited, a consultancy company that offers qualified person for pharmacovigilance and other pharmacovigilance solutions. So I'm here today to discuss the impact of Brexit, as with my colleagues, but really looking specifically at more of the impact on small and medium-sized enterprises, so SMEs, and subcontractors, and what it may mean for more of this sub-area of the pharmaceutical field. So in terms of what I'm looking to cover today, I wanted to go back and have, while you've heard this no doubt quite a lot throughout the day, I wanted to remind us of what Brexit actually means, what it covered, and maybe more importantly, what it didn't cover in its remit. And to look at some of the initial reaction to Brexit, particularly from our friends with the regulatory authorities. Then to look at some of the considerations for SMEs and subcontractors and how perhaps it's different from larger companies. Why are they different? What are some of the things that need to be considered? And then to go on to look at what can you, if you're an SME, do apart from pull your hair out and run away. Then moving on to look at subcontractors, again another specialist field. What can you do if you're a subcontractor? Do you need to do anything? Are there any opportunities out there, for example? And then finally looking to summarise everything and to see, is there any action we need to take now? What should we really take away from this? So just in case anyone wasn't aware, the UK voted in a referendum Thursday 23rd of June whether to remain or stay in the European Union. One of the things that has been quite an area of confusion, I think, is there's been an evolving role within Europe. So this was a vote about leaving the political union, the European Union. It wasn't, for example, talking about leaving the geographic area, if that would even be possible, the European Free Trade Area, the European Economic Area. So there are all these different models, and we'll come back to why that's important slightly later on. So the UK voted to leave the EU by quite a narrow margin, it's fair to say, but in terms of the number of votes, it was nearly 1.5 million more for the leave side. The other interesting point to note is, being a referendum and not an election, for example, there was no manifesto in place, so neither side had a plan for post-referendum for saying this is how it will look post-referendum should the UK leave. So while that's understandable for a referendum, it was similar, for example, when there was the vote in the UK on whether Scotland should leave or become an independent country or not. It does mean that now we're in this area where there's a lot of uncertainty. And as we know, for businesses, for the financial markets, this creates a lot of discomfort and uncertainty because people just want to know what is going to happen. So obviously there are a number of ways that Brexit could happen. We'll start to talk about hard and soft Brexit, for example. But while no one has left yet, there is actually something in the treaty. So it's in the Treaty on the European Union, otherwise known as the Lisbon Treaty. There's something called Article 50. So this allows a member state to leave the European Union, and there's a period of up to 2 years, after which it can only be extended if it has consensus from all member states. So while the UK doesn't have to use this, it's just to highlight that there is actually a mechanism for them to do it. The other interesting point we'll come on to talk about is around the timeline and what that means for your negotiating position. So obviously there was it's fair to say, quite a reaction in the media, both in the UK and abroad. Obviously there is a lot of shock at the decision and the uncertainty and what does this mean. And the first thing to say, until the UK formally leaves the European Union, it is business as usual. It seems an odd thing to say when we're talking about the impact and do we need a plan B and so forth, but the MHRA and EMA, for example, have been very keen to say that it is business as usual. We are still a full voting member of the committee, such as CHMP, for example, or PRAC for our safety colleagues, and obviously PRAC being chaired by the MHRA, Dr. Rain, that's clearly very important. And they've both made statements to this effect, which are included in the slides for your reference. It's also to say the regulatory framework, again, hasn't changed. So if you're a client that wishes to submit a new license, a centralised license, you wish to submit an authorisation where the UK is asked for scientific advice, or the UK is rapporteur, or you already have one under review, these things aren't changing, and they won't change even once Article 50 is invoked, because as we said before, there is a period of up to 2 years. So while it's important to plan, say if there's a product in earlier development, and clearly you want to start thinking medium and longer term, and things may change, for now there is no change to the regulatory framework and the UK's rights. That also applies to, for example, the rules for trade, for movement across borders, for migration, and so on. There's also no current change in the role of the European QPPV. So, for example, because we're still a member state within Europe, the UK QPs can still be based in the UK, pharmacovigilance systems can still be based in the UK, and it carries on as normal. That being said, given the uncertainty, despite the positions and you could say the pleas for calm from the authorities, clearly some companies are choosing to move their QP, perhaps in anticipation, away from the UK. So while there is no official reason to change, we are already seeing an impact with people moving their systems to other countries in Europe. So on that note, it's the uncertainty that is causing perhaps the issues, while in reality nothing has changed. Part of the reason for that is the UK Parliament hasn't set out its position yet. So this is causing a lot of difficulties because there is, for example, a minister for so-called Brexit, but they haven't yet released plans and there isn't yet a timetable beyond what we know from Article 50. So there are many questions. For example, do we even need to use Article 50? Will it be a so-called hard Brexit, which is where the preference for migration controls takes preference? So if that means losing access to the single market, that is seen as acceptable if you're supporting a hard Brexit. Or will it be a so-called soft Brexit, where the financial passporting, the access to the single market is seen as more important than the stricter controls on migration? The short answer is no one knows. Obviously, there are preferences given by lots of different companies. But again, the uncertainty if you're an SME in this space is you're not having as much of a voice into the discussions, and you're not sure which would be the preferable scenario for your company. Adding to this difficulty is there's no longer a dedicated Minister for Life Sciences, so there was previously someone who worked specifically with our industry to ensure that our interests are represented. And as we said previously, this was a referendum across the whole UK. It was really a matter for UK Parliament to look at our relationship and how interests are taken across the country. It wasn't specific for any one industry, and there wasn't any kind of plan to say how different sectors, such as the pharmaceutical industry, would be covered. It sounds very obvious, but it is important to say because we don't know how our interests will be represented, and not having someone within the cabinet does make it that bit harder, which is why we'll go on to see the role of some of the social networks and some of the consultation groups are so important. So what are some of the things to think about for, particularly if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise? So there are some unique challenges, and perhaps if we first look at some of the things that makes it easier for these larger companies, so for example GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, etc., that they can perhaps cope with what Brexit has thrown at them easier. So first of all, they have more of an infrastructure, so both in and outside of Europe. If, for example, the EMA offices were to move to another country, or it was necessary for the QP to move to another country, these larger companies tend to have more of a structure in all of their countries. So if the QP does need to move to, say, Germany or to Ireland, for example, they're much more likely to have a setup there already. They'll have contacts, they'll have local regulatory intelligence. It will be much easier for them to absorb this kind of change without the kind of impact that you'd expect from an SME. They're also able to use their performance across the whole company globally. So obviously due to currency fluctuations, due to the uncertainty we've mentioned before, there have been some drops in the market, and there's also been some uncertainty, which has meant we've seen drops in financial performance and financial results for companies, and particularly in the UK market. So if you're an SME that is perhaps only based in the UK, you're going to feel that impact a lot more than if you're a much larger company with, say, 50 to 100 plus offices, both in and outside the UK, where perhaps you're working with different currencies. You can set off some of the results and you can balance it with stronger results from elsewhere. In contrast, if you're an SME, again, you have much less of a global infrastructure, and overall you have much less of a voice. So we've obviously seen some of the groups such as the Association British Pharmaceutical Industry, ABPI, and the Bioindustry Association, BIA, taking quite a strong lead. So if you're, as we say, AZ, GSK, Amgen, for example, it's quite easy to ensure that your voice is heard. Whether it's listened to is perhaps a different discussion for another day, but if you are a larger company, as well as the infrastructure, you're also very much an active part of that discussion. You can ensure the points relevant to your company are heard and that you're having that active discussion. You're also very keyed into what the issues are, and you're thinking about your strategic view, and you're thinking, okay, this is what we need to consider, this is how we change our business's plans. If you're an SME, you may not have as much of an internal role for that. You may rely a lot on outside consultants, and a lot of your business may be in the UK. So then if your consultants need to move, for example, or to change the focus of their work, something we'll come on to, it makes it a lot harder to know where you can go to for advice. It's also much harder when it comes to having concerns over resourcing and managing employees, because again, if you're a small team, if you have perhaps 100 employees, say 10 of your employees need to either leave because they have concerns over remaining in the UK, or it's harder to now attract talent to the UK, which is again something else that we've seen since the referendum result. That impact is going to be much more strongly felt if you're a SME of 100 people than if you're a larger pharma of, say, 10,000 plus people. And again, it's when we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry and we're talking about very highly qualified technical people, not being able to attract someone of this caliber is going to have devastating impact on you if you're an SME. And finally, it's really looking, something we'll come on to with the subcontractor side, but if the subcontractors need to move, for example, many SMEs, they either outsource their pharmacovigilance function and their QPPV function completely. If that person does need to move from the UK, it's sometimes hard to know where to find good people. It's something we see with resourcing, but it's also worth saying on the vendor selection side, it's hard to find a good service provider, and we're seeing quite a change in the market for service providers, that there are people who are moving, there are people who are no longer offering certain services because they feel that the longer term market will not be there in the UK. So the market is always changing, and if you're an SME, sometimes it's hard to get access to that information, to know who you can trust and where you can get that good quality information from. So raising lots of problems, but what can you, if you're an SME listening to this, what can you do to address and to try mitigating some of these risks that we're discussing? So the first thing to say, after panicking many of you, is to say keep calm and carry on. It is still business as usual. As SMEs will know, it's always noses to the grindstone anyway, so it's very much a case of the business is still there, the markets are still there, we still have patients, prescribers to serve, so it is still business as usual. That being said, using contractors and service providers, it can have two sides. There are some concerns that we raised in the previous slide, but it can also be helpful because they service many clients. If you're not able to access some of these industry association groups directly through your company, often a good service provider will have that access and they will be able to keep you informed about what is happening and perhaps even to raise some of the concerns from your company on your behalf. So it's very much a case of keeping, up to date through your service providers and contractors, and also checking the likes of LinkedIn and other groups on there. Certainly there are several groups, of which some are given in the presentation, links that have been set up for example, qualified persons in the UK who are working towards what we need to do. But there are other groups there who are looking at the interest of smaller and medium-sized companies, and also some product-specific areas. So for example, looking at the concerns of biologics and biosimilars, looking at concerns of consumer health and over-the-counter products, and looking at concerns of generic companies. Because while we all work with the same regulations, there are differences depending on the size of your company and the kind of products in your portfolio. So given that there's a lack of coordination on the UK government side, one of the strongest messages we can say is that having that fragmentation on the industry side is really not going to help, because we're already having to work with quite a fragmented government organisation. So it's really important to make use of some of these, and it should be said, free resources through the likes of LinkedIn and using your consultant network, because that will be as important as ever through this ever-changing time. It's also trying to avoid making drastic decisions. It's often said when you're managing, for example, a stock portfolio, that where there's a drastic change, the first thing people want to do is to go in and withdraw their money, when maybe that's one of the worst things you can do, because the market will even out. While we've not seen something similar to Brexit before, it's a similar scenario. Going in and making drastic changes when the landscape isn't yet known, both politically and from the regulatory side, isn't wise. And that's one of the reasons really MHRA, EMA, etc., they're trying to plea for calm, because the last thing you should be doing really is to make drastic decisions around your licensing, over taking advantage of other commercial opportunities, because there are likely to be changes to the regulatory framework. There will have to be if the UK is no longer a member state, but to try and make those drastic changes now before it's even announced if the UK will be using Article 50, for example, may be unwise. So while it's not always possible, it's worth considering if there are any decisions on the commercial side that could possibly be held back. and currently it is thought that there may be decision in early 2017. There are a number of factors, such as the length of government that the current government has left before 2020, also European elections which are expected to take place Q2 in 2017. So while it's not always possible to hold back, it's worth considering thinking about your commercial decisions at this time. Another factor to consider is taking advantage of currency fluctuations. While it's not always possible for those who are working in more than one country and outside the UK, there is a weaker pound. Certainly just after the result, the pound lost a fair amount of value, while there has been some recovery. For our clients who are outside the UK, they certainly are seeing those services cheaper, which is perhaps from the services side, it's challenging, but if you are working with a service provider and you are the client yourselves, it could be an unexpected benefit. So it's something to bear in mind, particularly if you are going through contract negotiation or you're working with those providers on a short-term basis. As we've already said, being sure to network is really one of the things that can help you most. Even if it's a case of you want to find a consultant, you want to ask what you think are simple questions: where do I get information, what has been released so far? There are a number of links that we've provided in the group, but you could do a lot worse than using the links that several of myself and my colleagues earlier in the day have mentioned about other groups on LinkedIn, other groups through some of the industry associations. And if you're not sure where to go, one of the first steps you can take is just to ask any of us directly. We'd be happy to help. So we've mentioned a fair amount about SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises. What about from the other side, if you're actually providing services as a subcontractor? What are the things that you need to consider? Again, the first thing to say is until we leave, it's business as usual. So particularly if you're a subcontractor, the current rules around free movement within the European Union and migration, it remains the same. So whether it's you need to hire people for your own services company, whether it's you wish to work across the union, the same rules still apply and will do for up to 2 years past Article 50. Again, as we've said, while currency fluctuations work both ways, that can work in your favour, particularly if you're working with non-UK clients. So while they're looking to perhaps the negative side of the uncertainty, it's a good counter-argument myself and other colleagues have found that you can say about what it means for your service price. One thing to add is that around the regulatory framework, there's been a lot of discussion about what will it mean for European QPPVs who are based in the UK. Now, there's already been some discussion on this earlier in the day from one of my colleagues, Miranda Dolan, but right now it's not possible to say anything other than for those who are here, it is business as usual. The MHRA haven't announced any plans about whether they will introduce a national UK local responsible person, although many think it is highly likely. Again, that's something that really will come out and it depends on the negotiating position, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of people think it's quite likely. One thing to note there is we're not just talking about drug safety, we're talking about the wider pharmaceutical industry. So even if there are restrictions and we're no longer a full European member state after we leave the Union and it is more of a hard Brexit, there will always be a market for good quality pharmaceutical contractors. So, for example, for those of us who currently act as QPPVs, it may be that the QP support officers or the physicians who work with the QP, it may be that these people can be based outside the European Union, as in fact they are for some companies currently, even if the actual QP and deputy QP roles do have to be based in one of the other member states. As we just said, it's also possible that there will be national responsible persons for UK. And there are also a large number of other allied roles as we see the regulation take arms and legs and who knows what else. It's a huge scope of work and often, it needs really good quality contractors. So for example, some of the allied functions to the QPPV around training, around quality management system support, around regulatory intelligence, around these other kinds of areas like auditing and inspection preparation, it may be that people have to consider whether they move to another member state or whether they take on those other roles. And for many, that will be a personal decision. That's not really something that the regulation can say what should happen. It's something that we're recommending that people start to consider now. So while you can look at it short term and say you can work with your existing contracts, medium to long term, people are looking realistically at either a move or to alter their view slightly. But one of the things we'd also add is that doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. I think it's fair to say many QPPVs, particularly for SMEs, are used to wearing many hats. So it may be a case of one hat is taken off and another is worn. And as we focus perhaps less on the EU, if we're looking at something such as regulatory intelligence, for example, or system improvement, there are a lot of other markets to assist. So everywhere from the Americas to perhaps Asia and other emerging markets. We're seeing increasingly for the Middle East, for example, in Australia, they're taking a lot of their references from some of the regulation that the UK had a large role in when they brought the European legislation in. So it's worth remembering, even if we leave the EU, we still have a huge body of talented individuals and people who fed into the regulation, and instead of feeding that into further changes in the European trading bloc, it may be that it goes to, for example, Middle East, Asia, Africa and some of the other emerging markets. Which leads nicely on to talking about opportunities with Brexit. It perhaps seems a little of a dirty phrase because many people, for a good reason, we do work within a very regulated industry, and so it's easy to focus on the negatives and what perhaps we're losing. But it's worth remembering that there is an opportunity here, and hopefully we can work with our government to take this. So the first thing to say, and again particularly for SMEs, there aren't many advantages being an SME with this, but this is one. There is a large pharmaceutical market within the UK, so this doesn't change significantly with the referendum result, and while there's perhaps discussion on some of the figures that have been traded by both sides, it's fair to say that with no longer having membership fees and with challenges within the health service already, for example the increase in elderly population, newer more complex therapies to support, there's always going to be a market at home. So for many of particularly the smaller and micro enterprises, those who are working with very innovative products, you may find that actually you can focus more on the domestic market, and it's worth remembering that that's not gone away. Obviously that doesn't cover all SMEs, so for those who continue to trade outside the UK, we've already mentioned around currency fluctuations, for example, but another thing that's worth remembering, and this is where it's important to have a consultation because it's an opportunity, but it's not yet fixed because the government has not released its position, is it may be possible to reduce the amount of regulation and so-called red tape that we have in the UK. Obviously, many of the regulations we have in the UK have come from European directives. Some of those have been very helpful to harmonise and to help us work together. But there is another counter-argument to say it has made doing pharmaceutical research, to sell and license our products, it's made it very complicated. And so one of the things to consider is, could we actually reduce some of that red tape? And that would really have an impact, particularly on SMEs. Again, if we go back to the examples earlier of larger pharmaceutical companies, if you have tens of thousands of people, you can work very well. You have lots of people to look into the regulations, to figure out what it means, to set up governance models, etc. If you maybe have 100 people or less in your entire company, that can seem very daunting, if not impossible. So one of the things that really excites me, certainly working with some of my SME clients, is the idea that we can be more nimble and that we can help people get their products to market quicker. And we can look at some of the things that the MHRA has really taken a lead in, European member or not, such as around adaptive licensing, around the earlier use of scientific advice, and to really work with them in terms of getting some of these products to market quicker and perhaps taking more of a risk-based approach. in terms of, is there a room for a lighter touch? Already you see it with herbal medicines and homeopathics, but perhaps in terms of some of the more well-established products, and move into, for example, what we see in Asia in terms of the re-examination model versus our renewal model. And it may be there's a case for lighter touch regulation with what we're seeing with generics, for example. In terms of being outside the EU, it may also allow for a more nimble and flexible discussion around, for example, free trade agreements, and also how migration policies are tailored. So while I would be the last to suggest that we should get rid of migration, our industry really depends on migration of experienced, well-qualified personnel. We need to consider whether we can do more to actually perhaps increase migration in some markets. So rather than working with quotas, being part of a trading bloc, is there an opportunity for providing more, if not a points-based system, something similar to that, to allow the highly qualified people, wherever they are in the globe, to work with us in the UK? And also similarly for free trade agreements, again, if we're working with world trade tariffs, we perhaps don't have the negotiated agreements through the European Union, but if we're one single country, it may actually be easier to arrange an agreement directly. So for example, South Korea has the highest number of trade agreements anywhere in the world, and they're quite a small country. Countries such as Chile and Switzerland are also much higher in terms of the agreements they have. Many of you will have heard of the so-called TTIP, the agreement between the US and the EU, and seeing how cumbersome that is. Any time that you have to involve such a huge number of countries, there's always an element of compromise. Whereas if the UK can form those agreements with other countries directly, we may be cutting down again on the red tape and the burden there, and recognising that we still need to trade globally, but perhaps we can take a lighter, more risk-based approach, which is often the aim and music to the ears of many of our SME colleagues. So in summary, what are the points that I'd like you to take away from this? The first thing to say, as a reminder, that while everyone knows about a referendum, it's important to emphasise there was no formal plan. It was a referendum, it wasn't an election. There was no Brexit manifesto. Whether there should have been, I'm sure, is a discussion many of us could have separately. What this means is there are many uncertainties still to be worked out. Leading on from that, Brexit can mean many things, so until the UK government announces whether they're going to use Article 50, whether they're going to go for a hard or soft Brexit or something in between, it is business as usual. We are still a full European member state. All of the current directives, regulations, formalities still apply. In order to avoid not having the voice lost, it's essential for small and medium-sized enterprises and those subcontractor companies to work with other industry associations. That may be going by product portfolio, it may be going through national associations, it may be working with some of the groups that we're already seeing, but it's really important that we're working together and not providing a fractured voice, because as we've said, the government is already having to work on so many other industries. We need to make our point more clearly as one. And also not forgetting that domestic opportunities still apply, and this may provide a disproportionate amount of business and benefit for the small and medium-sized companies who don't have that global infrastructure, but again, there may be opportunities in the market at home. And while it is business as usual for the short term, it's certainly worth planning when we're thinking about free trade agreements, what we're going to do with other countries directly for the medium and long term. So while it's worth holding off on any drastic decisions in the immediate term, there's nothing to say you shouldn't start planning now for what could be quite an exciting opportunity. Thank you for your attention.